When you've been unemployed as long as I was, you stop caring about the little details. The factory job seemed perfect. A night shift security guard position at Rivermill, an old textile factory on the edge of town. It had been abandoned for years after some industrial mishap, but a group of investors recently purchased it. Rumors swirled about them converting the space into a warehouse, but nothing had come of it yet. The ad for the job was simple: overnight security, easy work, 15-hour, apply in person. The words easy work hooked me. I imagined myself sitting in a chair for 8 hours, maybe doing a lap or two around the factory, and pocketing a paycheck. It sounded too good to be true, but I didn't have the luxury of being picky. The manager, Craig, was a wiry guy in his 50s, with thinning hair and a crooked smile. He was friendly enough, but there was something about his demeanor that put me on edge, like he was eager to get rid of me. After a quick handshake and some paperwork, he gave me the tour. "This here's the office," he said, motioning to a cramped room with a desk and a wall of old monitors. Each one flickered with grainy footage from various parts of the factory, dimly lit hallways, rows of rusted machinery, and shadowy storage areas. The screens buzzed softly, their images distorted by static. Craig handed me a flashlight. "You'll need this. Half the lights in this place don't work, and the ones that do are temperamental. Walk the perimeter every 2 hours, check the cameras, and He hesitated, scratching the back of his neck. "Stay out of the East Wing." I raised an eyebrow. "Why? What's in the East Wing?" "Nothing you need to worry about," he said quickly. "Equipment over there is old and unstable. We're waiting on repairs. Just stick to the main areas, all right?" I nodded, but his words stuck with me. Something about his tone felt off, like he was leaving something out. Still, I figured it was just a liability thing. Maybe they didn't want me tripping over a loose pipe and suing them. After showing me the break room and emergency exits, Craig clapped me on the back. "You'll do fine," he said with that crooked smile. "See you in the morning." By the time Craig left, it was just after 10 p.m. The factory was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your ears. Even the hum of the ancient fluorescent lights seemed muffled. I made myself a cup of instant coffee in the break room, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling in my gut. It was just an old building, I told myself. Nothing to be scared of. The office was stuffy, filled with the smell of dust and stale coffee. I plopped down in the creaky swivel chair and scanned the monitors. Most of the cameras showed empty hallways, but a few caught glimpses of the machinery that hadn't been touched in years. Giant, hulking shapes covered in rust and grime. The East Wing camera flickered the most, cutting out for several seconds at a time before coming back. Craig hadn't mentioned much about the equipment, but the image showed rows of looms and spinning machines, their sharp edges silhouetted against the dim light. I spent the first couple of hours walking the perimeter, as instructed. The factory was massive, a maze of corridors that all looked the same. My flashlight cast long, wavering shadows on the walls, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often I'd hear a faint creak or the soft scuttle of rats in the walls. It was normal, I told myself. Old buildings make noises. But then I reached the East Wing. The East Wing corridor was colder than the rest of the factory. The temperature drop was immediate, enough to make me shiver despite my jacket. My flashlight beam wavered as I stepped into the hallway, its dim light barely illuminating the rows of machines ahead. The air felt heavier here, thick with the smell of oil and something else. Something metallic, like blood. I told myself I'd just walk to the end of the hallway and turn back. Craig had been clear about staying out of the East Wing, but curiosity tugged at me. Maybe it was just an old boiler or a draft making the air so cold. Maybe I was imagining things. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was my shadow. A tall, angular figure stretched across the wall, perfectly still. But then it moved, slowly, deliberately, darting out of view as if it had melted into the darkness. My heart slammed in my chest, and I swung my flashlight wildly. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty corridor. Nothing. Just the hum of the factory and the distant creak of metal settling. I backed out of the East Wing, my hands shaking. When I reached the office, I locked the door behind me and sat down, trying to steady my breathing. My eyes darted to the monitors, searching for any sign of movement. The East Wing camera was still flickering, its feed cutting in and out. For a moment, I thought I saw something. A faint blur in the corner of the screen. But it was gone before I could focus on it. It wasn't until after midnight that the whispers started. At first, I thought it was just the wind. The factory had plenty of cracks and crevices, and the draft whistled through the building like a distant sigh. But these whispers were different. Low, guttural, and impossible to pinpoint. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I leaned closer to the monitors, my pulse quickening. The whispers grew louder, almost like voices, but the words were distorted, garbled. I turned up the volume on the office microphone, hoping to catch something clearer, but all I heard was static. Then, on the East Wing feed, the shadow appeared again. It wasn't a trick of the light this time. The figure was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs unnaturally long. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, disappearing and reappearing as the camera flickered. My stomach churned as I watched it creep past one of the machines, its head tilting unnaturally, like it was listening for something. I grabbed the walkie-talkie Craig had given me. "Craig, are you there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the static. "There's something here." No response. I tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. The whispers faded, and for a moment I thought it was over. But then from somewhere deep in the factory, I heard the sound of metal scraping against concrete. Slow, deliberate, getting closer. I froze in the office chair, my ears straining to locate the source of the sound. It was faint at first, like nails dragging against a chalkboard, but it grew louder with every passing second. The monitors offered no clarity, just static on most feeds, with the occasional flicker of dimly lit hallways. The East Wing camera was completely black now, as if something had swallowed it whole. The scraping continued, rhythmic and deliberate, each screech setting my teeth on edge. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped out of the office. My breath clouded in the air, though it wasn't cold enough for that. The sound seemed to come from the direction of the East Wing, and despite every instinct screaming at me to stay put, I moved toward it. The corridor stretched out before me, darker than it had been earlier, as though the shadows had thickened, taking on a life of their own. My flashlight flickered erratically as I walked, casting fleeting glimmers of light across rusted machinery and crumbling walls. At the end of the hallway, the source of the noise became clear. A single steel door at the far corner of the East Wing. It wasn't locked, just slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. The scraping sound was louder now, almost deafening. It was coming from behind the door. "Hello?" My voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. The sound stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the noise. I hesitated, hand hovering over the door. The air on the other side felt heavy, oppressive, like the space itself was pressing against me. My heart hammered in my chest as I nudged the door open with the tip of my flashlight. Inside was a small storage room, empty save for an old, rusted workbench and scattered tools. The walls were lined with shelves, their surfaces covered in layers of dust. But there, on the concrete floor, was something that didn't belong. A set of deep scratches, jagged and uneven, carved into the ground as though something had been dragged. And then I heard it. A soft exhale, right behind me. I spun around, flashlight cutting through the darkness. The beam landed on the hallway, empty and silent. My breath hitched as I backed into the storage room, the light trembling in my hand. The oppressive air closed in around me, thick and suffocating. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, just outside the storage room, a figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't human. Its limbs were impossibly long, its body bent and twisted like a marionette tangled in its strings. Its head tilted to one side, unnaturally far as if studying me. My flashlight flickered again, and in that brief moment of darkness, it moved closer. When the light steadied, it was no longer at the end of the hallway. It was halfway to me. I stumbled back, my foot catching on one of the shelves. The figure stopped, its head tilting the other way. It didn't walk. It didn't run. It simply shifted, like the shadows had carried it forward. The flashlight went out completely. I fumbled for the walkie-talkie, my shaking fingers pressing the button. "Craig," I yelled, panic rising in my voice. "There's something here, something in the east wing." Static. Then a faint voice. "You weren't supposed to open the door." "What do you mean?" I shouted. "What's happening?" But there was no answer, only the low hum of the walkie as the shadows pressed closer around me. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in the dark. Seconds. Minutes. Time felt warped, stretched out by the overwhelming sense of dread. The air was heavy with an electric charge, making my skin crawl. Finally, the flashlight sputtered back to life, and I bolted. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. My boots pounded against the concrete as I sprinted down the hallway, past rows of rusting machines and flickering lights. Behind me, the whispers started again, louder and more urgent, like a chorus of voices echoing in my ears. The office. If I could just make it back to the office, I could lock the door and figure out what to do. My legs burned as I pushed myself harder, the weight of the shadows pressing against me with every step. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony that drowned out my own thoughts. Just as I rounded the corner to the office, the lights in the factory flickered, and I saw it again. The shadowy figure was ahead of me now, standing in the doorway of the office. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, its head brushing the top of the frame. It didn't move, but its presence was enough to send a wave of nausea crashing over me. I skidded to a halt, my heart pounding in my ears. The flashlight beam flickered, landing on the figure just as it began to dissolve into the darkness. It didn't vanish. It melted, its form breaking apart and slithering into the cracks in the walls and floor. And then it was gone. I didn't go into the office. I couldn't. Instead, I found myself wandering the factory in a daze, the whispers still echoing faintly around me. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what was happening. Craig knew something about this place, about the East Wing, but he hadn't told me the whole truth. As I turned a corner, I spotted something strange, a door I hadn't seen before, half hidden behind a stack of old pallets. It was smaller than the other doors in the factory, made of heavy steel with no markings or handles, just a keyhole in the center. The whispers grew louder as I approached, a chorus of low, guttural voices urging me forward. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the keyhole. The air around the door was icy cold, and I could feel a faint vibration emanating from the metal, as though something on the other side was alive. Before I could stop myself, I pressed my ear to the door. At first, there was only silence, but then I heard it. A deep, rasping breath, slow and deliberate, coming from the other side. The walkie crackled to life as I stumbled back from the door. Craig's voice came through, shaky and strained. "You need to get out of there. Now." "What the hell is going on, Craig?" I shouted, gripping the walkie tightly. "What's behind that door?" "It's not supposed to be open," he said, his voice barely audible over the static. "We sealed it off years ago. You shouldn't even be in that part of the factory." "Sealed what off?" I demanded. "What's down there?" Craig hesitated. Then, in a voice that sent a chill down my spine, he said, "It's not human." The rest of the night was a blur. The whispers turned into screams, the shadows pressed closer, and the figure in the East Wing appeared again and again, always just out of reach. I tried to escape, but every hallway led me back to that door in the basement. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the factory windows, the whispers had stopped. The air felt lighter, the shadows retreating into the corners. Craig was waiting for me outside when I stumbled out of the building, his face pale and drawn. "You survived," he said quietly. "That's more than most can say." I quit that morning, but the factory stayed with me. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers, and in my dreams, the shadow waits, watching. It started like any other job. I was fresh out of college and broke, so when I saw the night shift opening at the 24-hour convenience store, I didn't think twice. It was quiet, the pay wasn't awful, and I figured I could zone out most of the time. Besides, what's the worst that could happen? I asked too soon. On my first night, the manager, Steve, a guy with more gray hairs than teeth, gave me the rundown. "Lock the door at midnight. Don't go outside until sunrise. And for the love of God, don't check the back fridge after 3 a.m. He laughed like it was a joke, but the way his eyes darted made me second guess. The shift was boring at first. A few drunk college kids stumbled in for snacks, and a lady with a stroller bought cigarettes, which was weird enough. But at exactly midnight, the door chime went off, and in walked a man. He was tall, pale, and wearing a black coat that seemed too heavy for the weather. "Do you sell candles?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I pointed him to the aisle. He stared at me, unblinking, for what felt like too long before walking off. When he came back, he placed 3 black candles on the counter and a rusty key. "Keep this safe," he said. Before I could ask what he meant, he turned and walked out. I looked outside. He vanished into the empty street. Around 2 a.m., things got weird. The old TV in the corner, which I didn't even know worked, flickered on. Static filled the screen. I tried changing the channel, but it wouldn't budge. Then, in the middle of the static, I swear I saw a face. A pale, hollow-eyed woman, her lips moving silently. I yanked the cord from the wall. That's when the phone rang. The store phone hadn't rung once during my shift. The landline was dusty and tucked behind the counter, so I hesitated before picking up. "Don't let them in," a woman's voice whispered. "Who is this?" I asked, but all I heard was heavy breathing before the line went dead. My stomach dropped when I looked at the door. 2 figures stood outside, motionless, staring in. They weren't customers. I don't know how to explain it, but they just stood there. Their faces were shadowed under hoods, but I could tell they were watching me. One of them raised a hand and knocked. Not a normal knock, slow and deliberate, like they were testing me. I remembered Steve's words, "Lock the door at midnight, don't go outside." I stayed put, pretending to ignore them, but my heart pounded. When I blinked, they were gone. At 3:02 a.m. I made a mistake. I forgot Steve's warning. I needed to grab some milk for my coffee, and the back fridge was the closest. The second I opened the door, the lights in the store dimmed. The air turned freezing, and there was a smell, like rotting meat and sulfur. I heard something behind me, a soft scratching sound like claws dragging on metal. I turned slowly, and through the frost on the fridge glass, I saw it. A face, hollow eyes, sharp teeth, and a grin that stretched too wide. I slammed the fridge shut and ran back to the counter. By now I was shaking. I grabbed my phone to call Steve, but the screen was blank. Dead battery. Then I noticed something worse. The clock on the wall had stopped. 3:15 a.m., frozen. The silence in the store was deafening, like the world outside didn't exist anymore. That's when I heard the knock again. But this time, it wasn't at the front door. It was coming from the back door, the one that led to the alley. I crept to the back door, my hands trembling. The knocking was louder now, more urgent. "Who's there?" I called out. No answer. Through the peephole I saw nothing but darkness, even though the alley was usually lit by a flickering streetlight. Then, out of the shadows, the same pale face from the fridge appeared. Its mouth opened, but there was no sound, just a horrible gaping void. I stumbled back, locking the door. The knocking stopped, but something started scratching, long, slow drags against the metal. Desperate, I remembered the candles the man had left earlier. I lit all 3 and placed them on the counter. As soon as the flames flickered to life, the air in the store shifted. The scratching stopped, and for a moment I thought it worked. But then the lights cut out. In the darkness, I heard footsteps, bare feet slapping against the tile floor. They were inside now. I don't remember much of what happened next. I hid under the counter, clutching the rusty key. The footsteps grew louder, circling me, but when I closed my eyes and gripped the key tighter, the noise faded. When I opened my eyes again, the sun was rising, and the store was empty. Everything was back to normal. No scratches on the doors, no fridge monster, no candles. Steve showed up at 7 a.m., whistling like nothing happened. "You survived," he said with a smirk. "Guess you're not the new guy anymore." I quit that same day. They called it the easiest night shift in town, manning the desk at Hollow Pines Rest Home, a hospice facility nestled deep in the woods. The place had been around since the 50s, and most of the town didn't even know it existed. It catered to a small number of patients, people with no families or nowhere else to go. The job listing was vague. Overnight attendant, light duties, good pay. And when I showed up for the interview, the manager, an older woman named Mrs. Cartwright, barely asked any questions. She simply stared at me for an uncomfortably long time before nodding. "You'll do," she said, handing me a set of keys and a laminated list of rules. The list was strange. Some of the rules were normal. Keep the front door locked after 10 p.m. Log patient room checks every hour. But others felt wrong. Do not respond if you hear someone call your name from room 3. If the hall clock strikes 3:33 a.m., leave your post immediately and wait in the supply closet until 3:35 a.m. Never open the window in the break room, no matter what you see or hear outside. I laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke, but Mrs. Cartwright didn't crack a smile. "Just follow the rules," she said, "and you'll be fine." My first night started off easy enough. The building was old but well maintained, with polished wooden floors and the faint smell of antiseptic in the air. The front desk was in the main hallway, with patient rooms branching off to the left and right. The hallway was long, unnervingly so, with dim sconces lighting the way. There were only 6 patients that night, and most of them were asleep when I did my first check. Room 1 housed Mr. Patterson, an elderly man who muttered in his sleep. Room 4 had Mrs. Elkins, who stared blankly at the wall even when awake, her breathing so shallow I had to check twice to make sure she was alive. But it was room 3 that made me pause. The door was closed, and the little nameplate next to it was blank. According to the logbook, it hadn't been used in years. Still, as I passed by, I thought I heard something, a faint rustling sound, like fabric brushing against the floor. I stopped, pressing my ear to the door, and for a moment, I swore I heard breathing. I shook it off and continued down the hall. Old buildings creak. That's all it was. By midnight, I was back at the front desk, sipping coffee and scrolling through my phone. The building was eerily silent except for the occasional cough or shuffle from the patient rooms. It was peaceful, almost boring. I told myself I'd made the right call taking this job. Then, at exactly 12:30, I heard it. A soft knock at the front door. The desk monitor showed the view from the outside security camera, but the screen was blank, just static. The knock came again, louder this time. I stood, peering down the dim hallway toward the glass doors at the entrance. There was no one there. "Probably just an animal," I muttered, though my voice wavered. I sat back down, trying to ignore the prickling sensation at the back of my neck. But then came a third knock, heavier, more insistent. And this time, it wasn't at the front door. It was coming from room 3. I froze, my pulse thundering in my ears. The knock had been soft, almost polite, but it echoed through the empty hallway. My hand instinctively moved to the walkie-talkie on the desk, though I wasn't sure who I was planning to call. Mrs. Cartwright hadn't mentioned anyone else working nights. Gripping my flashlight, I made my way down the hall. The wooden floor creaked beneath my steps, the dim sconces casting flickering shadows. The air grew colder the closer I got to room 3, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. The knocking stopped as I reached the door. I stood there staring at the blank nameplate, my heart pounding. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft I could barely make out the words. It sounded like a woman's voice, low and trembling, calling my name. I took a step back, nearly dropping the flashlight. Mrs. Cartwright's rule came rushing back. Do not respond if you hear someone call your name from room 3. I turned and walked away as quickly as I could, not daring to look back. But as I reached the front desk, I could still hear the whispering, faint but persistent, following me through the halls. By 2 a.m., I was questioning my sanity. The whispering had faded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The hallways seemed darker than before, the sconces casting shadows that stretched and shifted unnaturally. Even the patients seemed off. Mrs. Elkins in room 4, who had been motionless earlier, was now sitting up, her unblinking eyes fixed on the door. At 3:33 a.m., the hall clock chimed. The sound was different from before, sharper, more deliberate, each chime reverberating through the building like a warning bell. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like something was about to happen. Mrs. Cartwright's rule flashed in my mind. If the hall clock strikes 3:33 a.m., leave your post immediately and wait in the supply closet until 3:35 a.m. I didn't question it. Grabbing the flashlight, I sprinted to the supply closet and locked the door behind me. The air was stifling in the cramped space, and I could hear my own ragged breathing. For 2 long minutes I waited, gripping the flashlight like it was a weapon. And then, just as the clock struck 3:35, the sound started. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate, pacing up and down the hallway outside. They were heavy, each step accompanied by the faint creak of the wooden floor. They passed by the closet door once, then twice, then stopped directly in front of it. I held my breath, my entire body trembling. For what felt like an eternity, there was only silence. Then the footsteps resumed, fading away until they were gone. When I finally emerged, the hallway was empty. The air felt lighter, as if whatever presence had been there was gone. I told myself it was over, that I just had to make it through a couple more hours until dawn. But as I walked back to the front desk, I noticed something odd. The break room window was open. I froze. Mrs. Cartwright's rule had been clear. Never open the window in the break room, no matter what you see or hear outside. The window hadn't been open earlier. I was sure of it. Cold air blew in from the woods, carrying with it the faint sound of rustling leaves. But there was something else too, a low, guttural sound, like someone or something breathing just outside. I approached the window cautiously, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Peering out into the darkness, I saw nothing at first, just trees swaying in the wind. Then, something moved. A figure stood at the edge of the woods, barely visible in the faint moonlight. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. I slammed the window shut and locked it, my hands shaking. The figure didn't react. It just stood there, motionless, as if it knew I couldn't escape. I locked the break room door and backed away, my pulse pounding in my ears. My flashlight beam flickered as I moved, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting the figure to somehow appear behind me. It hadn't moved from its spot at the edge of the woods, but that only made it worse. It was waiting. The hallway stretched before me, impossibly long, the dim sconces casting faint pools of light that didn't reach far enough. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint gust of air from the ancient vents made me flinch. I needed to finish my rounds, but I couldn't bring myself to leave the relative safety of the desk. The monitors showed static now, every single one of them. Even the camera feeds that had been functioning earlier were nothing but fuzz and faint flickers of black and white. I tapped the console, hoping to fix it, but the static remained. I told myself the figure outside wasn't real. Maybe it was my imagination, the result of too much caffeine and too little sleep. But the lingering image of its distorted silhouette burned in my mind. Then the whispering started again. The whispers came from the hallway, faint and indistinct at first, like wind through a crack in the wall. But as they grew louder, they formed words. My name, over and over, whispered by voices that overlapped and twisted, echoing through the corridor. I glanced at the logbook. Room checks were overdue. My chest tightened as I realized the whispers were coming from room 3. My flashlight felt heavier as I stepped into the hallway. The air grew colder with every step, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones. I hesitated outside room 3, staring at the closed door. The whispering stopped abruptly, and the silence was even worse. "Just open the door," a voice hissed, sharp and clear. I stumbled back, heart pounding. It wasn't the faint, distant whisper I'd heard before. This was right next to my ear, as if someone were standing behind me. I whipped around, but the hallway was empty. "Stay calm," I whispered to myself. "Just follow the rules." I forced myself to turn away from room 3 and walked toward the front desk, my steps shaky. The whispers didn't start again, but I could feel something behind me, something unseen, watching my every move. By the time I reached the desk, I was shaking. I sat down, gripping the edge of the table, trying to steady my breathing. The monitors were still filled with static, but I didn't care anymore. I didn't want to see whatever was out there. But then one of the monitors flickered. For a moment I thought it had come back online. But the image wasn't from inside the building. It was the woods. The figure was closer now, its pale, elongated form standing just beyond the tree line. It hadn't moved its head, but its entire body seemed to lean forward, as if it were straining to see me through the screen. Its arms were too long, its fingers scraping against the ground. The monitor flickered again, and the figure was gone. The walkie crackled to life. "You need to leave." Mrs. Cartwright's voice came through, panicked and breathless. "Get out of the building now." "What's happening?" I shouted into the walkie. "What is this thing?" She didn't answer. The line went dead, and the static on the monitors deepened, filling the room with a low hum that seemed to vibrate in my chest. Then the front door rattled, the glass shaking violently in its frame. I stared at the door, my blood running cold. A shadow passed across the frosted glass, impossibly tall and thin. Whatever was out there wasn't knocking this time. It was trying to get in. I grabbed the flashlight and ran. The rattling door grew louder behind me, the sound of metal and glass straining under pressure. The air felt thick, suffocating, as I sprinted down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The hall clock began to chime. 3:33 a.m. I skidded to a stop, the sound freezing me in place. The chimes weren't like normal bells. They were deeper, almost guttural, like the building itself was groaning in pain. I turned toward the supply closet, Mrs. Cartwright's warning ringing in my ears. Leave your post immediately and wait in the supply closet until 3:35 a.m. I stumbled into the closet, slamming the door behind me. The tiny space was pitch black, my flashlight barely illuminating the shelves of cleaning supplies and tools. My breath came in shallow gasps as I pressed my back against the wall, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. Outside, the footsteps began. They were slow, deliberate, and heavy, each one making the floorboards creak. They moved up and down the hallway, pausing outside each door as if searching for something or someone. When they stopped outside the supply closet, I held my breath, willing myself to be invisible. The doorknob rattled. I pressed myself harder against the wall, biting my lip to keep from screaming. The rattling stopped, and the footsteps moved on, fading into the distance. At exactly 3:35 a.m., the air shifted, the oppressive weight lifted, and the silence returned. I waited another minute before cracking the door open, peering into the hallway. It was empty. I didn't go back to the desk. I didn't care about the logbook or the cameras or any of the rules. I just wanted to get out. But as I reached the front door, I realized the glass had shattered. Shards littered the floor, glittering in the dim light. The cold night air seeped in, carrying with it the faint smell of rot. And then I saw it. The figure stood in the middle of the lobby, its elongated form towering over me, its head tilted sharply to one side, its glowing eyes fixed on mine. It didn't move, but the air around it seemed to warp, bending the light in unnatural ways. I backed away slowly, my legs trembling. The flashlight flickered in my hand, and I knew that if it went out, I wouldn't survive. The figure shifted slightly, its long fingers reaching out toward me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like the very fabric of reality was unraveling. Then the hall clock chimed again. The sound shattered the tension, and the figure recoiled, its form flickering like a bad signal. Taking my chance, I bolted through the shattered door and into the woods, not stopping until I reached the main road. I quit the next day, though I didn't need to. Mrs. Cartwright never called me back. A week later, I drove by the rest home and found it abandoned, the windows boarded up and the sign removed. No one in town seemed to remember it, and when I tried to search for it online, nothing came up. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispering again. And when I look out my window, I swear I see a figure standing at the edge of the woods, waiting.